Zain Lakhani. I'm the Director of Migrant Rights and Justice at the Women's Refugee Commission, which is a U.S.-based organization that is particularly focused on women, girls, and families, migrant, immigrant, and displaced women, girls, and families. And we work both in sort of the U.S. and the region and globally. So the Migrant Rights and Justice Program is our U.S. and the region, so Mexico and Central America, as well as the United States. And that's the division that I am the head of. So the report that we just put out, What About My Children? Family Separation Among Parents Deported to Honduras, it was really generated by a couple of different things that we were seeing. The first is, sort of beginning in last summer, so about a year ago, we started taking these trips to reception centers across Mexico and Central America to speak with deported migrants. So one of the things you might be aware of, and I'm sure, Taylor, you are very well aware of here, is that it's become much more difficult to get access to migrants' experiences or immigrants' experiences, particularly about what happens to them in detention and deportation while they're in the United States. So previously in prior years, we were able to get access to detention centers. We could go into detention centers and speak directly with migrants about what they were experiencing in detention, right? When we could learn about what detention conditions were like, we could do know your rights information. There was a lot that we could do from, going into detention centers that also allowed us to, if people were experiencing violations of U.S. policy or of law or of their rights, we could file claims on their behalf, right? We could really kind of do a lot from inside the detention center walls. And that access has really been cut off. So we're no longer able to get into detention centers to speak with people. And so what we sort of realized is if we want to understand what is happening to people in immigration enforcement, if we really want to understand what happens, when a parent is arrested and then detained and then deported, and whether or not, all of their parental rights are being protected, the only way we were really going to be able to find that out is if we went to speak with them after they had already been removed, because we just weren't going to get access to them when they were inside the United States. So in August, we began traveling to reception centers, as I said, across Central America, Mexico. We went to many locations in Mexico. We went to Guatemala. We went to Honduras. And we started hearing from parents that they were, at the time that they were arrested, and if they were facing deportation, they were not being given an opportunity to bring their children with them. So U.S. policy requires that if ICE is going to arrest a parent, or if they arrest somebody, they have to ask them if they are a parent. They have to make sure that those kids are safe, right? You can't arrest a parent and leave their 3-year-old screaming in the car. You have to make sure that that child is safe, right? And if you're going to deport that parent, you have to give them an opportunity to decide whether or not they're going to bring their children with them or make arrangements for their children to remain safely in the United States. So maybe they want to make their sister their legal guardian, or maybe they want to, make some other arrangements. But you have to give them the opportunity to decide if they want to reunify, bring their children back with them to Honduras or to El Salvador or to wherever it is that they're being removed to, or if they want their children to remain in the U.S. with somebody they have identified as a safe caregiver. And what parents were telling us was this was not happening, right? That they were showing up in these reception centers. They'd been arrested. They'd been placed in detention. They hadn't been given an opportunity to even talk to their children. Nobody asked them if they had children. Some of them arrived in the reception centers. They didn't even know where their children were or who was looking after them. They were just distraught and panicked because they did not know what was happening with their kids. And so, this was mostly, we were talking to reception center workers and some parents. This was back in August, but we realized, okay, we need to understand in much more detail, with much more specificity, what is actually going on with this. Because there is U.S. policy on the books, including policy passed by the Trump administration called the Detained Parents Directive, that says you have to do these 3 things. The Detained Parents Directive policy by the Trump administration is weaker than previous versions of the policy. There's a lot that it takes out, but it still says you have to do these same things. We're getting, we're hearing that this is not actually happening. And so we have to really kind of understand in more concentrated fashion. So what we did is, in November, before the elections in Honduras, with an organization called Physicians for Human Rights, we went down to the La Lima Reception Center in Honduras, and we were able to get permission to co-locate with some of the service providers inside the reception center to be able to speak both with the reception center workers and learn about what they were seeing every day, but also to speak with the deportees as they were coming off the plane, right? So those of you who are in Honduras or have worked in any reception center, capacity before, or been inside one in whatever country you're in, it's like, the planes land and there's just kind of a huge amount of chaos, right? Like people come in and they sort of go through all the different processing stations. They get whatever it is that they are going to be able to get from the reception center. Information is taken from them, and then they sort of move forward for, to wherever it is that they're next going to go. We were in that environment. So we didn't get to ask, and people were just coming off the plane, right? So it wasn't necessarily that we could do a lot of really, really in-depth interviews, but we were able to do several dozen semi-structured interviews with parents who were, able and had the physical and mental capacity and deep willingness to speak with us. But we also talked to, hundreds more of the 1,200 or so people who were deported in the week that we were there. And we also had in-depth conversations with reception center workers and the medical providers and all of the other service workers who were there. And so what we found is that there are systemic violations of all three of these requirements happening. So for the overwhelming majority of parents that we spoke to, ICE never asked them if they had children. For many of them, they were trying to tell ICE, my child is in an unsafe situation. My child is home alone. Nobody's looking after my child. Can you please just allow me to call, my mother so that she can come and look after my child, before you take me away. And they were finding they were being denied. We spoke with one man who was, he was arrested outside his home, and the babysitter was inside with his 3-year-old, and he was begging for ICE. He was begging ICE just to allow him to call the babysitter because his wife had already been detained. And so if he was taken, that there would be nobody, to look after his child. So he just wanted to ask the babysitter, will you please stay? And so he just wanted to call the babysitter, and ICE did not give him that opportunity, to call the babysitter. And he only found out later, after he'd already been deported, that the babysitter just on her own had stayed with his 3-year-old for, 11 days. We also found that for the vast majority of parents that we spoke to, when they were deported, they were never given an opportunity to decide whether they wanted to bring their children with them or not. So ICE never gave them an opportunity to decide if they were going to bring their kids. For most of the parents that we spoke to, they would have wanted to bring their kids with them. That's not true of every parent. There's lots of other organizations that have spoken to people for whom the answer is no, we would want our children to stay in the United States, but we needed the opportunity to, make my sister or my cousin, whoever, a legal guardian so that, they could enroll my child in school and get them access to medical care or, whatever, all the things that you need to do to take care of somebody, to take care of a child. Many, of my partner organizations, they say the majority of people that they spoke to would have wanted to make arrangements for their children to stay in the United States. The majority of people that we spoke to wanted to bring their children with them. Parents will make different choices. The point is they're not being given that choice, right? And what is so horrific to me, and I know to all of you, this is a really choiceless choice. Right? If in the end you are facing deportation and you have to decide whether or not you want to bring your U.S. citizen children with you to, your country of origin, or even your non-citizen children who may have a valid asylum claim or may have another valid claim to be able to remain in the United States, but you want to bring them back with you, or you want to separate from them, you want to make someone else their legal guardian. It really is a choiceless choice, but they're not even been given that. Right? And so these parents were just absolutely distraught. The time that they were experiencing between the moment they were arrested and the moment they were deported was as little as 4 or 5 days. Sometimes they were transferred to as many as 4 or 5 different facilities in between, which made it, almost impossible for them to find a lawyer, to tell, to talk to an advocate, to connect with anybody, to say, this is happening, I need to bring my kids, right? Or I need to make arrangements to bring my children. They were not really given the opportunity to be able to do that either, or really form a connection with an ICE officer to say, please help me, make arrangements to bring, my children, because they'd be in a place for a day and then they'd be transferred to another place. So, the pace and the speed of these transfers and the pace at which this is happening is also really kind of preventing their ability to do this. So then, so we found these systemic violations, and a lot of these parents were showing up in Honduras having wanted to bring their children and have never been given an opportunity to do so. The second thing, and I will just say, when we spoke to reception center workers and service providers, they said that our experiences were really just echoed across the populations that they had seen. For those of you who work in Honduras, you'll know, right? Everybody passes through La Lima, and so it's that one kind of central reception center point where every single person deported from the United States ends up in La Lima, or goes through La Lima first. And we asked the reception centers, how often is this happening? And one told us, 80% of the people who come through the La Lima reception center had children they left behind in the United States, were separated in some way from children they left behind in the United States. We don't know if all of those people would have wanted to bring their children with them, or all of those people experienced violations of the policy, but the number of parents who are being deported away from their children is really, really, really high. It is the overwhelming majority of people who are being removed. So the second thing I want to talk about that we talk about in the report are some of the barriers that parents who are deported without their children, or without being able to make arrangements for their children, face, trying to either reunify or trying to make arrangements for their children, to be safe after they've already been removed. And I think this is work that you are either going to have been very involved in or be much more familiar with, right? And I think during Q&A, it would be really interesting to have a dialogue to see what it is that you guys are seeing, on the ground as you work with people, as you work with deported populations. But what we found in Honduras is, there's several sets of challenges. The first is that once somebody is deported without their child, it becomes very, very difficult to make arrangements for either, to get the documents, the travel documents or administrative documents their child would need to join them, or to do the legal work to assign a separate guardian. So let's say, somebody is deported, without their child is 3 years old. Their child is a U.S. citizen but doesn't have a passport, right? If that person who is deported is the only legal guardian, the parent of the child, and there is no legal guardian, the person who's looking after the child is not a legal guardian, it's very difficult for that person to get the child a passport, right? Somebody would have to travel with that child to Honduras or wherever, right? If the child is with that person's undocumented sister, that person cannot bring that child on a plane, right? So they can't get the child a travel document, a visa to land in Honduras, a Honduran passport, any of the things that child would need, because they're not the legal guardian. And it's very difficult once the parent is already in Honduras to be able to work with the child welfare agency, to be able to work with a lawyer and a notary. How are they going to sign the documents? How are they going to show up and actually get the child a passport, right? It is very, very difficult to do. So making those kind of arrangements is very, very challenging. Same if you want to make, say, your sister your child's legal guardian. That is a very complicated legal process, as well it should be, right? You are handing your parental rights to somebody else, right? It is not something that you can just, do very easily. There's a lot of legal and court proceedings involved. Once you've already been deported and you can't go back to make those arrangements in court, it is extraordinarily difficult to do. So that child can be left in a very precarious situation with nobody who has the legal right, say, to make medical decisions for them. Nobody has the legal right to enroll them in school. All kinds of really important things that are necessary for that child to survive and to sort of live in the place. There's nobody, right, who has the legal right to do that. So those children are left in these very, very precarious situations. It's very difficult to bring them back. It's very difficult to make arrangements for them to have safe care. The second significant barrier that we encountered, or that we really sort of saw and we talk about in the report, is the real challenges from the receiving country side, right? So Honduras, for instance, in their emergency strategy, in their February 2025 emergency strategy, they listed family reunification and preventing family separation as one of their priority areas. We knew that it was something, they knew that it was something that was important, that they had to be attentive to, that they had to care about, that they wanted to care about and respond to. But receiving country governments like Honduras don't have the resources, they don't have the expertise, they're losing a lot of their humanitarian funding. The civil society organizations that would have helped with this have lost their USAID funding, right? The actual kind of mechanics or ability, of these receiving country governments to help create family reunification systems, to help create systemic ways, to prevent and respond to this are very, very impoverished, right? And it is very difficult without the expertise and without the resources and without the good data and the knowledge and the cooperation from the U.S. government for receiving country governments to begin to reunify families at scale. And in Honduras, we talked to somebody inside SUNOF, inside the sort of the directorate then of families, right? So like the agency that would have, had charge of this. And they said that despite the fact that there was no formal program for people to report separations, more than 400 parents tried to seek reunification through the Honduran government in 2025 alone. We went in November, so between the beginning of February and November, more than 400 parents, but they didn't have an established program or system. Right. And so that was another really significant barrier for a deported parent who has now landed. They were arrested, let's say, dropping their child off to school. They were transferred to 4 or 5 facilities. They may have lived in the U.S. for 20 years. They land in Honduras. They don't have close ties to Honduras. Right. And their children are back in the United States. They have no idea what to do, and the government is not set up, does not have the resources or the infrastructure or the expertise to be able to help them. And there is not those kind of cooperative agreements between receiving country governments and the U.S. government. So the U.S. government does not have established policies and procedures for international reunification that, say, the government of Honduras could follow. Right. And so it's just creating this situation where, at scale, you're dealing with, hundreds or thousands of people. It's just a really, really difficult situation. Those barriers are very, very high. And so a lot of what comes after our report, like if you read our report, we give a lot of recommendations. And I think this is, the part to me, at least, that is the most important, right? Because it's one thing to talk about all the problems, but then what are we going to do about it, right? And so we give a lot of recommendations at the end of the report. They're specifically tailored to Honduras, but I think they can be applied in a lot of different places, sort of across the region. So we talk about a lot of different things. We talk about, data collection inside the reception centers, right? How to make sure that the people inside reception centers who are collecting basic information about deportees as they arrive, make sure that that includes information about, are you a parent? Were you separated from your child? Where is your child? What is the contact information of the person who's caring for your child? Like, what is your contact information, right? Family tracing is kind of what we call it. Right, by doing sort of complex, or just doing basic family tracing, establishing who is a parent. Okay, having somebody, from this program, establishing a formal program. One recommendation we gave for Honduras was for SUNOF, then the Directorate, which is the agency that was responsible for children and families, to establish a formal family reunification program and have somebody who sits in the reception center. And then as part of the introductory screening, when every single person comes, you say, are you a parent? Yes, no. Did you leave your children behind in the United States? Were you able to make arrangements for them? No? Okay, go talk to this person, right? And then that person collects all the information, right? So that's a very basic step one. Right? It seems small, but it's huge, because then we have data, we have information, we know how many people this is happening to, we know how to get in touch. It's much easier to begin doing reunifications if we know where everybody is, if people know where their kids are, how to get in touch with them, if we know how to get in touch with those parents to be able to begin the family reunification process. Right? This is especially true for parents whose kids might have ended up in the child welfare system, where there's different requirements now that kick in we kind of have to know where they are, right, in order to be able to begin figuring out what we need to do and how to reunify. The role of civil society is going to have to play. So really basic data collection and family tracing that happens for every single person at the reception center, right? That's one recommendation. We have a bunch, but that's just an example of one that's like a really, really kind of basic, low level one that can be implemented in reception centers across the region. And thinking about standard questions that are asked in every reception center across the region. And this is where organizations like USCRI are incredibly valuable, because you work in multiple countries, right? So it's not just a matter of working with the government in one country, you are working in multiple countries and can coordinate and standardize, things like data collection across all of your different offices in different countries. And so working with you to, begin developing these systems could be very critical.